objectively, there is truth, goodness, and beauty in math. If I don't see it or appreciate it, the problem's in me. And the good thing about seeing that is I can change, but math doesn't change. So the people who do appreciate math appreciate something that is there and that I can also come to appreciate, even though it might take more work or repentance.
Yeah. Welcome to Scholé Sisters, the podcast for the classical homeschooling mama who seeks to learn and grow while she's helping her children learn and grow. Scholé Sisters is a casual conversation about topics that matter to those of us in the trenches of classical homeschooling who yearn for something more than just checking boxes and getting it all done. I'm your host, Brandy Venzel. You can find me over at afterthoughtsblog.net, spreading my Charlotte Mason joy through blog posts, study guides, audios, and more. My co-hosts today are Misty Winkler and Abby Wall. Misty is a second-generation homeschooler with 5 kids and too many projects. With her blog, podcast, and membership, she helps you organize your attitude so you can organize your life. Find her over at simplyconvivial.com. Abby is basically the queen of the Scholé Sistership. Abby is a country-living farmer rancher, a loving wife, and mom of 5 who homeschools and reads whenever she can. The end of the year is sneaking up on us, and with it comes the end of our annual 5x5 reading challenge. There will be prizes available for finishers, of course. Do you long for some accountability to help you get your reading done? Some interesting discussion? General help in finishing strong? All of that and more is available inside the Scholé Sistership. Just go to scholésisters.com/sistership and join us. Today's episode is the second of the 2 that we are doing that cover ideas from C.S. Lewis's book, The Abolition of Man. More specifically, his first essay in that book, entitled Men Without Chess. If you haven't listened to episode 97 yet, I recommend you go back and do so before listening to this one. Today, we're discussing yet another phrase that gets thrown around in classical circles, Ordo Amoris, or in English, ordering the affections. It's going to be a great conversation, and so, without further ado, let's get to it. Let's start off with our Scholé Everyday. Who would like to go first?
This is Abby, and I have been trying to furiously finish my 5x5. And I actually looked at my list, and I'm not as in bad of shape as I thought I was. So I feel like I can breathe a little sigh of relief and enjoy rereading. And I'm not even going to consider it a full reread because I think I only read like more than half of the book, which is Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. And it's the translation by Gregory Hayes. And it's a good translation. I do really enjoy this one, and it's very clear and sometimes funny, even though he's a Stoic philosopher, but it makes me laugh anyway, because they took themselves way too seriously. So I think I got through 75% of the book the last time I read it. And then, it got abandoned into the shelves. And so I found myself looking for books that I could finish. And this one's not very long. And it's kind of a proverbial style, kind of diary, kind of these interesting notes and observations about humanity and yourself and, these things that he's meditating upon. And some of them are, full of wisdom, and some of them are hilarious. And some of them are like, ooh, can't read that to the kids. And, he'll name drop like Socrates and, just different things. So this is in my ancients category. So I feel like it was a good fit and I can finish it. So I will double. Nice. I feel really good about it. I can finish it and it goes in my category.
I'll go next. This is Misty. And my Scholé Everyday pick is celebrating a tiny finish for those who have been around a while and maybe watched the Learning Well retreat, which was our second retreat. So that was like
Wow.
2018.
Wow.
At that time, we talked about having an author that you were going to read over the long haul. I think that was one of the things that Cindy mentioned. And we talked about slow reading one author for a really long time. And so I've been doing that. And I like maybe taking slow reading to a whole new level.
I think I know what this book is.
You have displaced me as the champion of slow reading.
Or a selection of this book.
Yes. So at that time, whatever that was, fall of 2018, I decided that my long haul book was going to be Matthew Henry's commentary on the entire Bible.
I knew this. That was my guess.
Wow.
It's a gigantic book. Sometimes it's sold in 4 volumes, but I have the 1 volume version that even though I don't need reading glasses, maybe I do when I read this book.
It doubles as like a weapon and a workout device.
Exactly. So I started with the book of Job. I don't know why I picked one of the longest books of the Bible as my first foray into the entire.
Because you don't believe in small steps and early
Like,
success. You're just like, I'm just going to do this. I'm going to do it the right way.
So I just finished reading Matthew Henry's commentary on Job.
Wow.
Brandy, this is where you need the applause.
Seriously.
Background noise.
Oh.
The crowd goes wild.
I
Way to
dream
go,
of
Misty.
having the button I could push as the engineer.
Yeah.
3 years. 3 years.
That's
My
amazing.
goal
Good
was-
job.
My goal was to read Matthew Henry's commentary on the entire Bible by the time I was 50. I'm going to be 40 next year, and I think I need to pick up the pace a little bit if I'm going to make that.
It's really easy to make a 5 into a 6 on your notes. So it's another option.
If it takes till I'm 60, that's still good. So I'm going to stick with it. I'm going to read the whole thing. And maybe I'll just make it in my life, however long the Lord gives me. Hopefully it will be long enough to finish Matthew Henry's commentary on the entire Bible.
If you do this for too long, we'll be afraid for you to finish. I feel like at the end, the only thing keeping her alive is
making a covenant here.
So that's me checking in on that goal 3 years later.
Good job.
Good job.
So mine, this is Brandy, is a history of education and antiquity by a French gentleman.
We're going to have to make up how to say his name. I own this book.
Yes.
Is this the one you sent me?
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
Well, I don't think you sent this to me, but I think I bought it because of you.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned it in a podcast, actually. I think this is one that I bought while you were talking. So is it Moreau? Is that how you would say it?
That's how I would say it.
H.I. Moreau.
Let's go with it.
Whenever it's French, I'm like, no matter what I do, it's going to be wrong. I should check with my French Canadian friends before I do these episodes, but instead I just really mess stuff up. So anyway, I'm on I just started chapter 4. So that is the old Athenian education, which I'm already very excited about. He's getting into Paideia at this point. So it's getting more excited. But on Sunday, I hit the chapter on pederasty. Looked up at my husband and I was like, is pederasty what I think it is? He's like, yes, it is. Should I read this on a Sunday? So anyway, that was actually a very interesting chapter because I mean, for real, considering our current circumstances and our culture and some of the things that go on. And I had just listened to an episode with Victor Davis Hanson on is it called the Satyricon, which is like an old, really interesting, if interesting is the right word, book, but he applies it to our current situation. Yes, the Satyricon, having to do with satyrs. And so it's just a very decadent sort of book, but there are principles that he pulls out of it and applies to our day. So I had listened to that around the same time that I was reading this chapter. And it was very interesting because the author actually gets into this idea of why was the culture and why were the children, why was this allowed? And why were the children vulnerable to this kind of, like, he never calls it abuse, but obviously in our day, we would call this abuse. And really, it was fascinating to me. He has two main reasons that he sees for why this was perpetuated in the culture. And I'm sure once it became a part of the culture, then it's really hard to get rid of, right? Because now they've defined normal. This including this. He was talking about how when it came to the women, so the wife was, let me see, I underlined this. The family could not be the educational center. And then he goes on to explain two main reasons why that is. Even that I thought was interesting, because it was like the children are vulnerable because the home can't provide this for them. And I don't think he meant homeschooling when he said the family couldn't be the educational center. I think he's more thinking about it from the Christian perspective of ultimately it's the parents' job.
To provide,
to make sure that education happens and that it's a certain kind of education.
Well, and that the paideia starts in the home.
Right. Yes. So then he gives two reasons for why this is. And the first one is basically that the wife is not educated. So he says the wife was kept in the background. She was considered fit enough to look after the baby, but no more. When the child was 7, it was taken out of her hands. And then he goes on to say, as for the father, he was absorbed in public affairs. For we must not forget that we are speaking of what was originally an aristocracy. He was a citizen and a man of politics before he was the head of the family. So, I mean, really, you're looking at this situation of the checked out dad and the uneducated or severely undereducated mother, which provides this perfect storm of vulnerability for the children because the parents are limited in their options. And the wife is limited in her judgment, right? Because she's not well educated. So,
and their authority, because one's not there and the other isn't given any authority either.
Right.
Whether or not she's equipped to use it, the culture doesn't give her any place to speak.
Right. So it was just very interesting to me to see that combination and think about some parallels in our own culture with busy parents or the peculiar struggles that go on in single parenting or just all sorts of things. And about how children often pay the price for our misprioritization and all sorts of things. Another thing he says throughout the chapters that I've read so far, culture and education go hand in hand. You always get the education that matches your culture. You know, which is like a frightening thing for those of us living right now. There was a part of me that was like, does this mean we can't fix anything? Those of us who have the instincts of like, we have to be very deliberate to push back against the culture. Reading him, I'm like, it's just not wrong to think that way, because he would say, otherwise your education is going to match the culture.
Yeah.
And you're just going to get more of the same.
Hi, Abby here to give you an inside look into the community we call the Sistership. It is the place for homeschooling moms to gather and engage in meaningful and fruitful conversation. If you've ever found yourself listening to the podcast and wanting to join the conversation, discuss the ideas presented, or ask a question, then join us inside Sistership. That is where we go in depth and extend the conversation to include all of you. We are passionate about reclaiming and pursuing our own education, and we know that real education happens best in community. Sistership is the place to find your sisters. We have a feature that allows you to search for people near you. We want homeschooling moms to connect locally, and Sistership is here to help. We are fond of saying that friends don't let friends read alone, and we have an active and engaged online community if people in your local area haven't joined yet. Together, we read widely, think deeply, and apply faithfully the educational philosophy and good and great books. So join today.
On that note, we should transition to our topical discussion. Today, well, it's kind of funny. So we thought we had never done an Ordo Amoris episode. And we sold it.
What an oversight.
It was like the second thing we did. It wasn't like the second thing. It was literally the second thing we did.
Episode number 2.
Yeah. So possibly my creative podcast titles have struck again. And that's why we didn't know, because I didn't actually name it Ordo Amoris. I thought I was being clever and named it What's Love Got to Do with It? Anyway, so we were wrong, which means this is still going to be our second episode on Men Without Chess. but it's not going to be what we initially thought it was going to be when we planned it, because we already did that episode and didn't know.
It's also our second episode on Ordo Amoris.
Right. So, but we are still discussing Men Without Chess, because I do know some people grabbed the essay and read it, hearing that this was coming up. For those of you who were anticipating this, you will not be let down. It's just going to be a little different. So I went through and mapped out some of the principles from our last episode that we kind of talked about, just to make sure we're all remembering what came before, because we're not going to go back over all these things necessarily. Like, these are more things that we're going to assume now. Things like beauty is objective. Lewis says our job is to irrigate deserts. So he says much of the time, the problem isn't over emoting with our students. It's more apathy, that they don't care enough about anything. Emotions can conform to reality or not conform to reality, and emotions should conform to reality. That's the ideal. And sentiment is important, but what we want is right sentiment. So objects, like a waterfall, we talked about the waterfall last time. Those things, situations also, stories, these things can merit certain sentiments. So we want to actually have right sentiment. So that brings us to this term, Ordo Amoris. And my first question for you guys is, of course, who would like to take a stab at trying to tell us what is Ordo Amoris? What does the term actually mean?
Ordered love.
That's the literal translation. This is a Latin phrase. So would you like to expand on that?
Where's your dictionary, Misty?
Yeah, really. How's that dictionary helping you now?
Do you want to know what love means or order?
Oh, no. Abby, please rescue us.
Well, the other one that gets thrown around a lot is ordering of the affections.
Yes.
That's true.
Do you think we can use them interchangeably? They mean exactly the same thing.
I mean, that's what I do.
Yeah,
I do too.
No, because it is a Latin term, Ordo Amoris. Some people translate it and use the word love, and some people use the word affections. And I think affections, it has an older use than how we use it today.
Yeah.
It does get to this idea of sentiment, which again, I think we often misuse, or sentiment. I mean, all these words there are so many good words that have had rich and specific meanings that we have kind of made bland or shallow in the last few generations. And so I think sentiment and affection both have become weakened words and kind of just mean, oh, however you feel. And that's not the way that, someone like C.S. Lewis or translators of Augustine or Aristotle meant the words.
Mm-hmm.
I tried to look up sentiment on the etymological dictionary online. So it says that it says one's personal experience, one's own feeling, from the Old French sentiment, which is just spelled different and probably pronounced different. Feeling, affection, or opinion, which I thought was interesting. So it's referring to what one feels about something. It says in the 1800s, it had a wide application, commonly a thought that was colored by or proceeding from emotion. I thought I'd also look up affection. So affection is an emotion of the mind, a passion, as opposed to reason. So a disposition, a love, an attraction, an enthusiasm, all of those things play into this idea of affection. I was thinking with Ordo Amoris and this idea of ordering our affections or ordering our loves, it ties us back to what we talked about last time. Emotions can conform to reality or not. They could be proportionate to a situation or not. Like, there's different ways of them being appropriate, because it could be that they're, to go back to the irrigate deserts comment, they could be too intense or not intense enough. So there's like the intensity part.
Mm-hmm.
But then also you could just have an inappropriate emotion. And sometimes it's you're misunderstanding the situation. Like, as a mom, I've had that situation where I felt like this anger I felt like it was a righteous anger. There was an injustice that one of my children, I thought, did against another. And I got mad at that injustice. But actually, I didn't know the whole story and I was totally wrong.
Yeah.
That would be that my emotion, even though I felt like it was totally right, didn't conform to reality because I didn't know reality.
Mm-hmm.
And that can happen across the whole board. So when we talk about ordering the affections, I think of it in those two. I don't know if there's more components, but I think of it in terms of those two components of, is the intensity correct? For example, I think if you have too much intensity, you could love something and it's good to love that thing, but too much intensity turns it into idolatry. Mm-hmm. And then the reality scale, like how closely conformed to reality are we in this situation?
That really does hit why this is so needed today, and also why we need to keep coming back to the idea and talking about it more. Lewis noticed the direction the culture was headed and was doing his best to like throw the red flag and say like, hold on, you don't want to go this way. But we have, and we've gone so far down that road of subjectivity that the thought that a feeling we have could be wrong is a lot to wrap our heads around.
Yeah. For the most part, people don't tell you that your emotions are wrong. Like that's not something you're really allowed to say.
Right.
No, you're definitely not.
I tell my kids that though.
Oh, we know.
Yes.
We're just not sure that the glee involved is proportionate to the situation. Okay, I found the quote from Abolition where Lewis references Augustine. So he says, St. Augustine defines virtue as Ordo Amoris, the ordinate condition of the affections in which every object is accorded that kind of degree of love which is appropriate to it. Aristotle says that the aim of education is to make the pupil like and dislike what he ought. Does that mean that this is the actual end of education? Like this is the end of education? Or is ordering the affections a means to our overall educational goals?
What would be a different educational goal that Ordo Amoris would get you?
I guess even though I've read this essay so many times, I don't know if I glossed over it or my brain just wasn't working every time, but I was thinking of ordering the affections as a task, not a state. But the way he puts it here, and I'm not saying it's not a task, but the way he puts it here is Augustine says virtue equals Ordo Amoris.
Yes.
And we often say, well, the goal of education is virtue.
Right.
I mean, he would have to say to this question, yeah, that is the end. But I just always thought of it as, I mean, not like it's something you put on your to-do list, but I had thought of it as this thing that we do.
Or even it's how you go about getting some goal.
Right.
Instead of it being the goal.
Like you order the affections in order to get to virtue.
Right.
And I think I thought that because I could see other things that you would also do in order to try to get to virtue. Things like physical training, right? Because we do believe there's a physical component to virtue. I think I put it in that category. Like, here's this grab bag of methods and things we do that are trying to get us to virtue. He's saying it is virtue. That's what virtue is.
Mm-hmm.
So reading in preparation for this, I picked up a book a couple months ago called Liberal Arts for the Christian Life, and it was edited by Jeffrey Davis and Philip Ryken. It's a bunch of essays on education and the Christian liberal arts. One of the quotes that was in one of the essays is by T.S. Eliot, and it says, "No one can become really educated without having pursued some study in which he took no interest. For it is part of education to learn to interest ourselves in subjects for which we have no aptitude." I thought that this went along with loving things or ordering our affections in reality. There are things which we don't have aptitude for, and there are things that you were saying a spectrum, right? You can go to idolatry or not in proper proportion, but there's also things that aren't interesting to us. And we need to learn to be interested in those things because that's also ordering our affections.
Do you guys have examples where you actually went from there's this thing, this area of life or whatever. I don't like it. I'm not interested in it. I don't want to study it. I don't want to think about it, whatever. It's annoying. And you grew to at least love it more than you did. I'm not saying it has to be your favorite thing, but like, have you seen that transformation in yourself?
Yes.
Yes.
One is the obvious of math. Because I grew up as, not a math person. And that was just a thing. Everyone knows about that kind of a person. I'm not a math person.
Right.
That's like culturally okay, right? I am an English person. And, mostly people who are language arts and humanities aren't math people. So it's legitimate. I remember encountering this idea in different forms early on and almost feeling irritable over it. Like, stop, you're trying to take away this little piece of my identity of being not a math person and say it's not okay. But it isn't okay.
Right.
Objectively, there is truth, goodness, and beauty in math. And so if I don't see it or appreciate it, the problem's in me. And the good thing about seeing that is I can change, but math doesn't change. So the people who do appreciate math appreciate something that is there and that I can also come to appreciate, even though it might take more work or repentance.
Yeah. What's yours, Abby?
I don't think I'm very good at memorizing things. We just finished up a long weekend of talking only about memory and remembrance. And for years, it was a struggle for me to memorize things. And while I always thought it was so neat to see how people could memorize poems and, different things, like it's not something that I feel like I have an aptitude for. I really need to concentrate and work on it. But after years and years of doing morning time and memory work, I don't think I've gotten better, but I have retained a lot. It still takes me a long time to memorize things. My kids memorize things way faster than I do. But just because there's a lack of speed or maybe an expectation that I should be doing this faster, I guess I've reframed this, that it doesn't matter how long it takes me to memorize this because the act of doing it is actually just good for me to do. I think I'm a fairly curious person by nature, but there are some things that I don't necessarily love doing, like butchering has become something that I used to try and get out of because my husband was good at it and we would have family and friends over to help with it. But over the past few years, it has just become necessary for me to increase my aptitude and learning capacity to butcher and whole animals in a lot of ways. So I love cooking, I love preparing food, but the processing of meat, when you're doing two, 1,200 pound steers back to back is,
yeah.
But you get good. And when you get better at something, I think it always translates to getting more affection towards it, right? Because when you get good at something, it becomes easier. And therefore, it doesn't feel like you're trying to think about it and then still do it. Like when you're learning a new skill. The book by Cal Newport, So Good They Can't Ignore You, talks a lot about that. Just honing your craft. And how it's really hard and difficult and you really stink at first. But as you practice, you get better at it. And so I think we give up too easily. We're too ready for the quick win, the quick success. If I'm not instantly good at it, I can see my kids doing this too. Like, I really, suck at cursive. I don't want to do this. And you're like, actually, you're still going to learn how to do it because you're going to always suck at it if you don't practice it. So it's, sorry, my kids say suck and it's probably, I was not allowed to say that as a child.
So you're enjoying yourself now?
Yeah. So now hearing myself now and my mom won't listen to this, so it'll be okay.
It's hard for me to choose mine because I have had a lot of things I had to repent of over the years. So I was like, how could I choose just one thing? But one thing that came to mind really early on was my disconnection from the natural world. So I loved to be outside in the heat and I loved sunshine, but I didn't know the name of anything, like a few crops because my family was involved in farming. So there were certain things I could identify from just, riding in the truck with my dad or my grandpa or whatever. But I mean, like, I didn't know a dove from a hawk from a crow. I mean, maybe if I'd really sat and thought about it, but if I saw a bird, I called it bird in my head. Like it didn't have a name. And tree was the same way. I would say a tree or a bush or a flower, but I didn't even think in terms of names for those things when we first started homeschooling. I probably vaguely knew some of them, but that was not the way my brain even thought about them. And I think some of this comes from living in my head.
Yep.
Not being super aware of my surroundings at all. But I think that's why probably Charlotte Mason was so good for me, because she's saying that even with your 4 or 5-year-old, you should be learning the names of all these things. And I was like, oh my gosh, I felt so smart at one point, and I'm so dumb. I'm so ignorant. I know nothing. And so I remember like those early years of keeping a list and trying to learn to use the darn bird book. And how do you, like, I don't know the difference between a wing and a type of a beak and a type of a foot and all this stuff. But Abby, it is kind of what you were saying. All of a sudden I was like, I kind of like birds.
Yeah.
I probably didn't like birds because I didn't know anything about them.
Yeah.
I hadn't looked at them long enough to realize that they were actually interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like I have a whole list of things like that because I was the kind of person that was really excited, but about a limited range of subjects.
So many of us.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So what about the reverse? Has there been anything where you're like, oh, I'm going to have to tone it down? Like,
well, we know that you have.
Right. But I'm like, is that normal or is that just
Well, I think for me early on, I think I read way too many homeschooling books, and not necessarily educational philosophy books, but just like how-tos and practicalities. Like when my kids, before they were school age, when I was still thinking about homeschooling my kids, because I wasn't totally sold on the idea until we got a little closer. But going way overboard on reading all of the popular homeschooling books and things like that, and curriculum choices and all these different things that didn't actually inform the goals of education. Like they were very utilitarian, very practical, and those things had their places. But I think I had to back way down on that. And for me, it took me a long time to kind of settle in, and I had a real winding path to classical Christian education and Charlotte Mason. Like I didn't know anyone who was doing those things. So it took me a while to get there.
Yeah.
I mean, I think those how-to ones probably gave me confidence to be able to do kindergarten in a couple of grades when my kids were young and things like that. But luckily I found good materials, good philosophy, and it was a much slower process of changing because I went to Montessori school and preschool and kindergarten, and I did K through 12 plus college, all in state schools, government schools. So kind of a slow process in changing. And I'm sure I still have hangups from my public education because it is so different. But I think going slower through it and making, sustainable changes over time, has been a good thing. But it was, definitely way too excited about kindergarten when I should have just kept with reading books to them and listening to fun songs and just having them play. Right.
Yeah. So. I think a big one for me was learning to love reading less. It's not that I don't love reading, but I think when my kids were young, I was reading a lot. I got to that point where it was sort of idolatrous. If I didn't have time to read, people were sick or people were needy or whatever, I could be mean. I don't know that it was necessarily this idea of Ordo Amoris. I think it was just normal Christian conviction of people are supposed to be more important than your hobbies. It was a disordered love. Like reading is good and wanting to be wise is good, but wanting to be wise at the expense of those who God gave you as your duty to take care of is sinful. And the option obviously is not to not read. Like other things that I've loved too much, there is actually the option of not engaging in those things, like puzzles.
I didn't know this about you, Brandy.
I can't do puzzles. I can't do puzzles during the school year because I can't stop doing puzzles. This pretty much goes for any kind of puzzle. I know you're probably thinking like pictures on it doesn't matter what it is. Like I get obsessed and I have a problem. So I'm not allowed to do puzzles unless we're on school break. But, like you can't not read, right? So like I had to face that head on and learn to be appropriate. I had to learn to be appropriate, which looking back, I'm like, that's totally Ordo Amoris. But I didn't call it that at the time.
Well, and in all those kind of applications, I think that's a great summary of what we're helping our kids with too. Learning to be appropriate. I mean, that's a goal of education, right?
Yeah.
So many ways that applies.
I feel like there's a t-shirt hiding in there somewhere. Like a bookmark or something. We'll have to dash that out.
Learning to be appropriate. Yeah.
Well, didn't we I feel like at one point on Facebook, our hashtag was civilizing barbarians.
Yes.
One book at a time or something. Yeah. We said we might need to bring that back. What does this mean? Missy, I'm making the assumption that you've never loved anything too much. This mean of me?
No, I was just trying to bring it back to actually talking about the subject. And I think we've spent enough time on examples. Story time's over.
So how does the idea of Ordo Amoris relate to our reading and study? This has been discussed, like the implications for our children and our homeschools already in episode 2. But, what are the implications for us as mothers, as people, our reading and learning?
I think a big thing, at least for me, when it comes to my reading and study, is that since learning about this concept, I mean, I've known about it since, Cindy Rollins in the old days. But as far as like actually connecting the ramifications of it, I think that's more recent for me. Like that's probably in the last 5 years or something. Realizing how wrong I can be. I think I always read wanting to be wise. Like I think I can honestly say that, but I didn't necessarily want to face the places where I was wrong. That's been a thing that I've been trying to do over the last 5 years. Letting a book confront me and not just putting it down or running away or deciding the author doesn't know what they're talking about or whatever the temptation is at the time, but really trying to engage with things that make me uncomfortable and repent if I decide I need to. After hearing them out, possibly I have to think differently or be differently.
Yeah. The point of the reading isn't just gaining tidbits of knowledge or confirming things we already thought so that we have a good argument.
Yeah.
But like really trying to understand what the author is getting at and thinking about that, like giving it an honest hearing and a reasonable hearing, whether or not you end up agreeing with it.
I had the thought just today when I was reading, and it's a different Augustine quote, but it's, our hearts are restless until they find rest in you and in God. And I was thinking about how Scholé is often thought of as, that rest, right? It's that leisure, it's worship, it's these different things. And I was thinking how ordering our affections leads us to that rest because it points us towards Christ. And before I have read far too many books or neglected things because I was in story grip or tried to do too much, either because I was keeping track or things like that. Restful learning or leisure is just that enjoyment for the thing itself. I think that is something that is going to inform me more as I'm going, because as my kids are getting older, my time is just less and less. There's less buffer, it feels like, just with things. And rightly so. My kids need me for things and I need to be engaged in what they're doing and those kinds of things, instead of, a discouragement because I'm not getting to all the things that I want to do. It's that resting in that I have time for the things that are true, good, and beautiful and important, and that I can rest in that fact.
One thing I noticed in this last year about Ordo Amoris in reading Augustine's On Christian Teaching, he has quite a number of pages in there that are talking about love and how Ordo Amoris, ordering your loves and loving the good things in the right order, loving people because they are made in the image of God,
mm-hmm.
and loving created things because God made them. And so he talks, he just spends several pages developing what a rightly ordered love looks like and what it means. I don't know why, but I had never put together the thought that Ordo Amoris and ordering your affections comes down to Jesus's summary of the law.
Oh.
And Augustine says it explicitly. It's how he starts it out, although now I can't find it.
I think it's on page 17.
17. I do have a book dart there. But he says that, Jesus commands us to love God with all our heart and all our soul and all our mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. That is the basis for taking charge of our loves and not just letting whatever love we happen to have drive us, but actually trying to direct our loves and develop them, put them on the right course. This is a part of sanctification. It's pleasing God. It's what we're supposed to be doing with our lives. That whole idea of loving God with all of our whole being, if that's an end for human beings, which it is, then what we're talking about here with Ordo Amoris is correct, because even Augustine is not claiming to have come up with this idea himself, right? This is going back to Aristotle, but he's showing that Aristotle was on the right track here. And this is why. We were made to love what is good. And we are happiest, truly happy, when we love what ought to be loved. And when our appetites are not in control of our actions. These aren't unrelated subjects. Our education, the schooling efforts, just our general hobbies and life, all of it goes together and all of it fits under this heading. In all that we do, we are either loving correctly or not. So it always applies.
Is this the quote? When it says all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, it leaves no part of your life free from this obligation, no part free, as it were, to back out and enjoy some other thing. Any other object of love that enters the mind should be swept towards the same destination as to which the whole flood of our love is directed.
Yes, there you go.
So a person who loves their neighbor properly should, in concert with him, aim to love God with all his heart, all his soul, and all his mind.
So it's the task of education, but it's also a task that's never complete.
And that's because it is actual virtue.
Yes.
To bring us full circle, he's saying virtue is the state of having perfectly ordered affections.
Yes.
Which means we never reach it in this life. That makes it more exciting. There's so much to do.
We're always working at it.
That's right.
Yes.
I was thinking about how this actually relates to the idea of our 5x5 challenge. And I'm not saying every book should be a book that stretches you. There's something to be said for keeping up the loves you do have, expanding the knowledge in areas that you already are knowledgeable. Like all of that is perfectly valid. But I was thinking about how it probably would pay, when I think about my plan for next year, to have one section that is something that I'm not as familiar with, or that I know that I don't love rightly. Like if I'm struggling in some sort of area, I think I even told you guys one time that I just get burnt out on cooking because of all like the gluten-free, sugar-free, I'm like fun-free. I get tired of it. And then I kind of get a bad attitude. And every time it's just a well-written book on basically on cooking or food or even nutrition, if it's the right kind of book, brings the love back to a more proper place for me. I think about the 5x5 challenge strategically. We could say, I didn't know anything about birds. Like I could have said, I'm going to read 5 books on birds this year. And it doesn't even have to be like adult books. I'm a firm believer in a well-written children's book being helpful.
Yes,
but
sure.
Finding the areas where we know we don't have any love or the right kind of love or whatever, and spending a little bit of time on that.
I was thinking the same thing actually a couple days ago. So
really?
Great minds. Yeah. I have 2 topics that I'm thinking about delving into because I need to be more affectionate towards them. It would be Latin and writing.
Mm-hmm. I know we said we weren't really talking about our homeschools today, but I do think that, sometimes if we're not careful in our homeschools, our apathy can be contagious to our kids. And then we're like, why doesn't my kid like this subject or this book or this whatever? And actually it's, I don't actually like it. Mm-hmm. And they're catching my attitude. And so sometimes ordering our affections, it's not even just for us. It's if we're going to homeschool and we're going to do this project, then we're setting ourselves up as the educator of the child, which means we have to get some of this stuff together. Not that we have to be already perfect, but we have to be in the state of getting these things together ourselves.
Yeah, I think there's the idea or advice, I don't know if it's advice, caution, I don't know, out there, that the teacher is the master, especially in classical circles. And sometimes that makes it extra difficult for moms to feel like they're able to be a teacher if they're not masters already at all the subjects they're supposed to be educating their children in. But I don't think it's so much that we have to have already mastered everything that we're supposed to teach our children, so much as we have to be lovers of knowledge and model that excitement to learn and willingness to learn. And we have to be careful not to give that example, which is so common today that we get caught up in so easily, of identifying ourselves with particular interests or specialties to the point of excluding ourselves from other topics. That whole idea of, I am a humanities and a language person, and so I'm not a math person. Or I am a science person, therefore, I'm not really that into literature. These kind of categories are a part of normal conversation in our culture. And I think an important thing for us to model is interest in anything and everything that is a legitimate interest. And that doesn't mean that we have to become experts or masters of all of them. It means we just have to be open and curious and
wonder. Right?
Yeah. We have to be willing to learn, willing to be interested, willing to love.
What is that? There's that book by C.S. Lewis where he's writing letters to that couple. Do you remember what it's called?
Is that one, A Severe Mercy?
Severe Mercy. Thank you. Yes. I haven't read that book in like 15 years, but I'm going to give it a go.
This is good.
Super dangerous. I may be making this whole thing up.
Randy's lying again.
So I remember that book because the first time I read that book, I think I was engaged to Sai, I think. And I was fascinated by this idea that was presented in the book of, I love this person. This person loves or is interested in this thing. Isn't that enough for me to try to become interested in it? And this wasn't like a how to improve your marriage sort of way of talking about it. It was this idea that if the beloved finds it interesting and you actually think the beloved is worth loving, then maybe they know something you don't know. But the implication, which it's Lewis, right? So of course he would make this implication, knowing what we know now about, for example, Ordo Amoris. Just because you and your spouse or you and the beloved don't have this one thing in common doesn't mean that that's forever how it has to be. You can choose to have that in common because you can change what you love. And I just remember thinking that was so profound. And I actually wondered how that would have improved my childhood with my sister, because I was pretty sure I wasn't interested in anything she was interested in. And I look back and I'm like, I was a terrible sister. Like I was a terrible sister to my sister. And I feel bad about it. But nobody ever told me that I should maybe learn to be it's possible they did and I just didn't listen.
I was the same way. It was like, if one of my siblings liked something, that was actually reason to not like it.
I know.
That was their thing.
Oh. It's like the exact opposite of what Lewis says we should be doing.
Yeah.
But I was thinking about this. We will never be totally virtuous. That is Christ. That is not us. But the idea that we can change our lives and we don't have to like you already said some of this, like we don't have to categorize ourselves as not of this person or not of that person, but like that there's hope for us, that God can give us love for these things. And that starts by combating the ignorance. Because I am a firm believer that lots of times we don't love when we don't know, because knowledge is required to have a relationship. Like otherwise you're a stranger and you don't love strangers. That's weird. So like it has to be the thing, whatever it is, has to be not a stranger for you to even have a chance of loving it. I guess this means I have to have like a house cleaning category or something.
Well, that would have been my example that I would have talked about if I had gone into telling a whole nother story, which I've told plenty often over the years, I think.
Did you love house cleaning too much?
I hated it too much.
Well, it was an intense affection.
I loved my own convenience.
Oh, well, we don't even have time to get into that, but that kind of a thing is also, Ordo Amoris covers that too, right? Us loving those kinds of things too much. We can all parent out of that place too, right? It's convenient for me to not confront this problem with this child or take this child to this place or whatever. I'm not actually choosing what is best for the child. I'm choosing what's convenient for me. Well, any final parting quotes or anything?
I had so many quotes.
I know, I did too.
I think this is a great quote to end on.
Perfect.
This is more from Augustine on Christian teaching. He reminds us, he's tying together loving what we ought to love and also happiness and enjoyment of God. So he reminds us that having ordered loves is its own reward. Like it is a happy, wonderful way to live. So it's not like we're doing this because we have to and it's torturous. It brings blessing and happiness. So he said, somehow there also results an advantage to us. That is when we love other people. Since God does not let the compassion we show to the needy go unrewarded, this reward is the supreme reward, that we might thoroughly enjoy him, and that all of us who enjoy him may enjoy one another in him.
Beautiful.
This is the chief end of man. We glorify God and enjoy him forever.
Amen. Well, thank you guys for coming for this recording today. Been a lovely chat.
Yes. Thank you, Brandy.
Thanks, Brandy.
That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening and being a part of the sisterhood of the podcast. Make sure you've signed up to follow the show in your favorite podcast player so that you don't miss our upcoming episodes. All of the books and things mentioned in today's episode are linked in our show notes. Just go to scholésisters.com/SS98 to check it out. Remember, if you want your 5x5 challenge finisher prize, accountability, and encouragement to help you finish your challenge strong, join us in the Scholé Sistership by going to scholésisters.com/sistership and signing up. Because of Thanksgiving, our next episode will be in 3 weeks rather than 2. We hope you all have a wonderful time with your families. When we return, we're discussing a chapter of the fabulous book, The Supper of the Lamb by Robert Farrar Capon. Until then, we want to remind you once again that homeschooling is a marathon you needn't run alone. So open up your eyes and look around you. Find your sisters. Hang on just a second. I think I have a child on FaceTime. Hold on. Okay. I was like, oh, she can hear me. Very sad. I have a lot to say. Just Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to follow the outline that you have here. Yeah. Imagine that.
Why can't I ever find the button? Like, never, ever can I find the button.